It was a little after 3 in the afternoon on October 13th, 1973, when the MV Blythe Star began to lean. At first, the list to starboard was small enough to go unnoticed by anyone not used to the subtle movements of a ship at sea. But the men aboard were no strangers to these waters, and they felt the change almost immediately. Coffee mugs slid across the mess table. The deck tilted just enough to make walking feel uneven, and in a narrow-beamed coastal freighter with a heavy load stacked high above the deck, that was a warning no one could afford to ignore. The Blythe Star was a 144-foot cargo vessel of 734 gross tons, built in 1955 in Britain and brought to Australia to work the coastal trade. She had been modified in the 1960s to carry more freight on deck, a change that raised her center of gravity and made her more vulnerable to stability problems. On this voyage, she had left Hobart that morning, bound for King Island with 10 men aboard. Her cargo included bales of superphosphate fertilizer, crates of beer, and assorted general supplies, everyday freight for small communities that relied on sea transport. The weather was calm, the sea moderate, and there was nothing to suggest the run would be anything but routine. The crew began checking immediately. Hatches were opened, bilges inspected, pumps run. There was no flooding in the engine room. The engine gauges read normal. Nothing obvious explained the growing tilt. But on deck, the load told another story. The bales of fertilizer and beer stacked topside were heavy, and in the long ocean swell off Tasmania's rugged southwest coast, even a slight shift could be enough to push a small vessel toward the edge of stability. By mid-afternoon, the list was severe. Water began sloshing over the lower rail. The pumps could not correct the problem. Captain George Cruikshank, a man with decades of sea service, understood that the Blythe Star's condition was deteriorating fast. He ordered the inflatable life raft prepared. It was a small, canopy-covered craft barely over 10 feet long, intended for emergencies measured in hours, not weeks. There was no panic, but every man moved quickly. Life jackets went on. A few tins of food, bottles of water, a signaling mirror, and minimal first aid gear were gathered. There was no chance to recover the emergency radio. The sea was calm, but the ship's angle was worsening by the minute. Cruikshank gave the order: abandon ship. The 10 men climbed into the raft and pushed off. From a short distance, they watched their ship roll further, her stern dipping, bow lifting. She went down without spectacle, no explosion, no breakup, just a slow, deliberate slide beneath the surface until nothing was left but an empty patch of water. No distress call had been sent after their last routine radio contact hours earlier. No one ashore knew they were in danger. The first night passed under clear skies. The raft rose and fell in the swell, every movement amplified in the cramped space. By dawn, the men began rationing supplies, 1 biscuit each, a small sip of water. They attempted fishing but caught nothing. The canopy kept off the sun but trapped heat. Salt water seeped in, soaking clothes and skin. By the 3rd day, the weather worsened. Strong winds drove spray over the raft, soaking everyone inside. Salt sores began to form. The smell of fuel and rubber mixed with the odor of unwashed bodies. The men tried to sleep in shifts, but there was no real comfort, only brief dozing, knees drawn up, backs pressed against one another for warmth. Meanwhile, on shore, questions were being asked. The Blythe Star was overdue at King Island. Her owners contacted authorities. A search began, but the sea is vast and an orange raft is small. Aircraft and ships scanned wide areas, but without a last known position, they were looking for a needle in a moving haystack. On the 7th day, tragedy struck. Chief Engineer Tom Lawrence, weakened by dehydration and exposure, died during the night. The men wrapped his body as best they could and committed him to the sea. The loss was a blow to morale, but there was no choice but to continue the fight to survive. The days blended together. The biscuits were gone. The water was almost finished. They collected rain when they could, using cupped hands and scraps of cloth. Saltwater sores became infected. The motion of the raft never stopped. On the 10th day, another life was lost. Able seaman David Ryan, who had been growing weaker for days, slipped away during the night. Another burial at sea followed, the surviving 8 speaking few words, too drained for ceremony. By the 12th day, hope flared briefly when the jagged coastline of Tasmania's west appeared on the horizon. They could see cliffs, beaches, and the line of surf breaking white. But the seas along that stretch are notorious, and in their fragile raft, the risk of being driven onto rocks was too great. The current carried them north, the shoreline sliding by, heartbreakingly close, yet unreachable. The raft was deteriorating. A seam had begun to leak. Men took turns bailing with anything they could use. Sleep was shallow, broken by cramps, shivering, or the slap of waves. Skin cracked from the salt. Minds wandered from exhaustion. Still, they kept scanning for ships. On the 16th day, just after dawn, one of the men spotted a fishing boat in the distance near the mouth of the Pieman River. The crew waved, shouted, and used the signaling mirror. The fishermen saw them and altered course. Minutes later, the survivors were pulled aboard. 8 gaunt, sunburned men barely able to stand, but alive. The relief was tempered by grief. 2 shipmates had been left behind in the Tasman. The survivors were taken to hospital, treated for dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure. Their account made headlines across Australia, and the ordeal became one of the longest survival stories in recent Australian maritime history. The cause of the sinking was left to theory. Investigators concluded that a shift in the heavy deck cargo was the most likely trigger, but without the wreck, certainty was impossible. For nearly 3 decades, the Blythe Star remained missing. In 2002, a CSIRO research vessel mapping the seabed found her. She lay upright just over 6 miles off Southwest Cape, bow pointing north. The discovery confirmed the crew's accounts and finally placed the last chapter of the Blythe Star's story on the chart. Today, she is remembered not just for how she sank, but for the 16 days her crew fought the sea in a craft meant to hold them only briefly. For the families of Tom Lawrence and David Ryan, the Tasman Sea will always hold part of their story. For the 8 who returned, the memory of that raft, the cold, the hunger, the endless horizon, never faded. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.